So today we're gonna go over. Okay, so I'm gonna go over some tricks, tips for just basic photography in general, and there are some videos I would like to show. So first of all, in order to increase what we call depth, because an image in itself is kind of like a one-dimensional picture, right? So in order to show the 3D element of an image, you can add what we call this foreground image. So there is a video explaining how you can do this. We're just gonna go over and watch it. Alright, so can you guys all see it?
To launch a culinary empire. Tools you claim everyone has.
We've all been for a day out to an amazing location like this. Look, we've got a lovely place to walk, shady places to sit, trees. We've got this astonishing view going on over here. This is the Blackmore Vale in Dorset, and on a day like today, it is absolutely fantastic. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to try and take a picture to record all that, isn't it? We set up our camera, we line it all up, and what we get is a very flat, boring and totally forgettable picture. This is because our minds and our brains create an impression of a place. For example, even though I'm facing this way, I know that I've got these trees either side of me and somewhere shady to sit, and I'm in a lovely location. But a photograph is, by definition, one-dimensional. It's flat. Now, I know there's 3D imaging coming on the way, but for now, just assume it's flat. What you can do to improve that is to use foreground to introduce an element of depth into the picture. It's illusory, but it works. What do I mean by adding foreground? Right, if I was to go and sit over here on this bench, you've still got a nice picture of me sitting on a bench, but it's still kind of flat. But if the camera comes over...
So as we can see right here, right? If you're positioning your camera in front of him like this, there's no what we call foreground element, and we can see later if you just change your angle, you're going to get a completely different view
over here,
right,
close to the bench.
So now we can see the cameraman is going to go over
and uses these timber slats from here as foreground, which lead back to me.
So as we can see, now we have these lines, leading lines going toward him, and that is generally a much better composition and much more interesting picture than what we just saw before.
Now, all of a sudden, this picture has got depth. You have a real sensation of sitting on the bench next to me, or at least that I am sitting on a bench. This bit which leads you to me is also called a leading line. Very often, elements of composition kind of join together and do two jobs at once. But this is about foreground. There is a video about leading lines in the composition section. Adding foreground to a picture is a matter of getting yourself on the move and wriggling around and aligning the elements of a picture up in such a way that there is something close into the camera and something further away to create a layered sort of an effect. One misty morning I spotted this stick in a pool, and as you can see, it's completely lost, very forgettable and totally flat. But there was a cobweb in the grass at the edge of the puddle. By laying down and wriggling myself about to place the cobweb in the foreground on one side of the picture and the stick and its reflection in the opposite one, it all comes together and creates a sense of depth. There are 3 layers of depth in this picture. The cobweb in the first layer, leading to the stick in the middle layer, and the mist, trees and sky make the background layer. Let's go and put this into practice. Here's one straight away, look. It's quite a nice view down the walkway. We've got that building and the old lamppost and the blue sky going on. But as you can probably see in the video camera, it's actually quite a flat, not particularly interesting sort of a picture.
So it's pretty flat.
But it's really simple to add some foreground. If we just come over this way a bit, half a dozen paces, and just put a bit of this tree close into the camera and frame up the building with some of that foliage, like this, all of a sudden, it just adds an element of depth to the picture, which wasn't there before.
Right. So that's basically some interesting stuff to talk about foregrounds, right? You gotta have these, individual elements in front of it, in front of the camera. That's why you see sometimes if you shoot portrait, for example, you may go behind a tree and then have part of the tree in the shot. These are elements to enhance your images. Okay. So next up is the fact that because we want to use manual modes, but sometimes you may not feel as comfortable using it first, you can always choose to use what we call priority modes. Okay. So on priority modes, as you can see here, pointer here. This is M stands for manual, then A is for aperture priority, S for shutter priority, and of course for Canon it will be like this, kind of the same thing. So as a photographer, your job is to capture the perfect moment. Okay, it doesn't really matter which mode you use. Even if you use auto mode and you get a perfect image, great for you. But sometimes, most of the time, that does not happen. Anyways, you don't always have to use full manual modes. There are aperture and shutter priority. So this goes back to the last lesson in which we talk about the exposure triangle. So what do you want to prioritize? Do you want to prioritize your aperture, or do you want to prioritize your shutter? Right. What this means is that maybe if you want to capture a good portrait, so that means you're gonna have a blurry background. Okay, then you're gonna put the aperture in priority, right? Because we know the opening of the aperture will allow more light to come in, and then have this wonderful bokeh in the background, or the blurry background in the background, background. So as the name states, it prioritizes aperture over everything else. So it will automatically correct your shutter speed for you to create a balanced image with a proper exposure most of the times, right? So when you are setting aperture priority, the only thing you're controlling essentially is your aperture. Okay, so you can use your wheel at the back of your camera, right, to control your aperture settings if you want it to open up or close it smaller. And your camera does the rest. It controls your shutter speed, right? And then you can also set your ISO accordingly as well. For shutter speed, it will be the opposite. Okay, so now you're controlling the shutter speed, so your camera controls the aperture. So if you're shooting someone maybe like moving very fast, you want to prioritize shutter, right? We don't want a blurry image of someone walking very fast or doing a fast motion. Therefore, cranking up your shutter speed into like 1/500 is maybe more important than at your aperture, for example. So when you're using shutter priority, you're going to be controlling the shutter, and vice versa. If you're using your aperture priority, you will control your aperture, and the rest of the things your camera will decide for you. So that is priority modes. Okay. And lastly, we're going to talk about generally how to achieve a well-balanced image. So there's something called a histogram. A histogram could be used in your camera. It could be there, or you can have it after you take a picture, and there's different settings as you go through them. And we're gonna talk about the differences between JPEG and RAW. So if you want to have a good image, please always shoot RAW. Okay. So let's talk about the RAW differences between RAW and JPEG first.
What's going on, guys? This is YPA. Today I'm in London. I'm going to be talking to you about what is RAW. Let's get into it. So I'm always telling people that one of the most important things when you're starting out with photography is to make sure that you are shooting in RAW. But what does that mean? What even is RAW? What is RAW? So I'm going to tell you guys just exactly what RAW is in less than 5 points, so let's do that. Basically, RAW is just a file format, much like JPEG, which is probably what you're shooting your photos in right now if you don't know what RAW is. The difference is, a RAW is an uncompressed file format. So when you're shooting JPEG, the camera will apply in-camera edits like contrast, white balance, a little bit of saturation, etc. and then compress that file into a smaller file and then ship it out to your memory card. However, when you shoot in RAW, none of this happens. So when you shoot in RAW, you get exactly what you shoot on the camera. It's a much larger file and it's uncompressed. So what this means is Basically, RAW retains a lot more information from the image when it's saved as a file. Whilst JPEG might be great if you're not really applying any after shoot edits to the image, probably best to start shooting in RAW now rather than later. 2. Once you've captured a RAW image, it needs to be processed and compressed to its final file state, which is most likely going to actually be JPEG. The difference is when you convert the file to a JPEG outside of the camera, you have much more control and flexibility over the final look of the image. You've used editing software to manipulate the pixels and final look of the image before you convert it to JPEG, and obviously hopefully create the look that you want, not the look the camera wants. Make sense? 3. Most cameras automatically shoot in JPEG unless you manually go into the settings of your DSLR and change it to shooting in RAW. Normally, RAW files can only be opened or viewed if you have a RAW file viewer on your computer or editing software that deals with that kind of file. So unless the person you're sending the RAW images to is also a photographer, it's not very likely that they're going to be able to open those images or view them. That means it's probably best to convert the image to a JPEG before sending it over. It's also important to note that whilst a RAW can be compressed and converted to a JPEG file, it can't be done in reverse because you can't uncompress the JPEG and then make it into a RAW. Shooting in RAW gives you way more flexibility when it comes to editing and the final outcome of your images. I would highly recommend shooting in RAW now rather than later to save yourself hassle further down the line. I have a bunch of images from when I went to the Alps pre-shooting in RAW, and they're amazing photos, but I can't edit them to the extent I want to shoot in JPEG. I hate myself in a sense for it, so don't be me. So to wrap this up and summarise, a RAW file is an uncompressed image file shot in camera without any in-camera edits applied to it. It allows a higher range of flexibility when editing pixels within an image and allows you to fix exposure and colours to a higher degree. As the RAW file is uncompressed, it is a larger file than the JPEG, so obviously it's going to take up more space on a memory card, but of course it can be compressed and converted to a JPEG on the computer. So that's it, guys. I hope you now have
So, as he said, RAW is just another camera, format. It's going to be uncompressed. Therefore, when you're editing your image, you're going to be edit a much more, balanced, or there's more information in the file. Is the better way to say it, right? So when you're tweaking it, for example, in your photo software, editing software, it is going to be much easier to edit a RAW file rather than a JPEG file. Just give me a second. Okay. Alright, so next up, which will be the final element, that will be the histogram. This is probably the most complex thing that we've talked about so far in this course. And let's go through it. Okay, here.
There's a pattern to genius. There's a method behind the magic. I always tell people.
What's happening here?
Oh, welcome back to the channel.
Is this a Chris only tutorial?
Well, we're doing the tutorial.
Oh, I thought because I do all of the tutorials, you would do the
Okay,
tutorial.
alright, we'll do a Chris only tutorial this time. It's going to be on histograms, what you need to know about them, how to understand them, and why they're going to be useful. Let's go.
I'm a hot mess, so I'm gonna get out of this frame.
So let's get started. Histograms, they can be very confusing for a new photographer or a new videographer, and a lot of times people will just turn them off, tuck them away, hide them away so you don't see them and just never think of them again. But you shouldn't do that, and we're going to go into what they are. We're going to try to understand how to use them, and hopefully you will put them back up so you can see them and use them to your advantage. Histograms are basically just a graph. It's a frequency plot of how frequent certain pixel values occur in your image. So we're going to use some illustrations here that I've created, and I'm going to put my laptop up here so we can go through these together. First of all, let's look at this image of these two goofballs. And when you're looking at an image, you got to think of it as a grid of pixels. It's basically just a stack of boxes that are all different colors. And speaking of color, let's strip out the color for now and only look at black and white. We're going to simplify this here, and we're going to reduce the resolution. The image turns into literally a grid of boxes. So now we're down to a very low resolution grid here. This one is, I think, 5 by 4 pixels, so there's 20 boxes here. And they're all various different shades of gray. In order to make this a little bit more simple, instead of having an 8-bit image that has 256 shades of gray, we're going to reduce the bit rate down to a 2-bit image, so there's only 4 shades of gray. Now we've got a 4 by 5 grid of different color shades of gray. In fact, there's only 4 shades of gray, so we can actually put numbers on them. So we're gonna...
Is it frozen for you guys?
Yeah.
First of all, let's look at this.
Can you see it?
It's stuck on the pattern. It's like stuck on the ad.
Oh, okay. Give me a second and I'll stop this. Okay. Which one is that? Okay. Here. Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
What's happening here?
Oh, welcome back to the channel.
Is this a Chris only tutorial?
Well, you were doing the tutorial.
Oh,
I forgot I froze.
Pardon?
Never mind. I think it's better now.
Okay.
So let's get started. Histograms, they can be very confusing for a new photographer or a new videographer. And a lot of times people will just turn them off, tuck them away, hide them away so you don't see them and just never think of them again. But you shouldn't do that. And we're going to go into what they are. We're going to try to understand how to use them, and hopefully you will put them back up so you can see them and use them to your advantage. Histograms are basically just a graph. It's a frequency plot of how frequent certain pixel values occur in your image. So we're going to use some illustrations here that I've created, and I'm going to pull my laptop up here so we can go through these together. First of all, let's look at this image of these two goofballs. And when you're looking at an image, you got to think of it as a grid of pixels. It's basically just a stack of boxes that are all different colors. And speaking of color, let's strip out the color for now and only look at black and white. We're going to simplify this here, and we're going to reduce the resolution. The image turns into literally a grid of boxes. So now we're down to a very low resolution grid here. This one is, I think, 5 by 4 pixels, so there's 20 boxes here. And they're all various different shades of gray. In order to make this a little bit more simple, instead of having an 8-bit image that has 256 shades of gray, we're going to reduce the bit rate down to a 2-bit image, so there's only 4 shades of gray. Now we've got a 4 by 5 grid of different color shades of gray. And in fact, there's only 4 shades of gray, so we can actually put numbers on them. So we're going to call pure black 0. We're going to call dark gray 1. We're going to call light gray 2. And we're going to call pure white 3. And again, this is simplistic. In a normal image that's 8 bits, you'd have 0 as black, 255 as white, for a total of 256 different tones. In this case, obviously it's simplified, and now we've only got 4 different tones spread across 20 different pixels here. If you've been noticing, the histogram has changed radically, and now there's 4 spikes. And as you can guess, those 4 spikes correlate with the 4 different tones that we have in our image. So 0 being black, 1 being dark gray, 2 being light gray, and 3 being pure white. You may also notice that they're of different heights. So we can actually look on the y-axis of our histogram, and if you can pretend that there's numbers there that are counting how many pixels there are. So, for example, if we look at our image, we can count this Texas looking block here. There's actually 5 black pixels, or 5 pixels that have the value of 0. If you look on the graph I've made for you here, the height of that line goes up to 5. Makes sense, right? Okay, let's look at our dark gray pixels, or the pixels that are of value number 1. There's only 4 of those pixels. So lo and behold, the spike for dark gray, or 1, is only a count of 4. So the light gray pixels, or a pixel value of 2, this is the most frequently encountered value, and there's 6 of them. So if you look at the histogram, this goes up to the level of 6. And finally, pure white pixels, there's only 5 of them. So again, the spike as it goes only up to 5. So it doesn't matter that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 pixels. The key is looking at how high those lines are relative to one another. If you can understand this on a simplified basis, we can go back up to our full-blown, full-resolution image, and we can see how the histogram will change and how in turn it can be useful. If we just go right back to full resolution with only 4 pixel values, this is what our image would look like. As you can see here, it looks pretty crappy. It looks like a posterized effect, and that's actually the effect that I used to get this. It's a 4-level posterized effect, and it literally makes the image only 4 different tones. But if you look at the histogram, literally the histogram didn't change all that much. You still have 4 categories or 4 different pixel values, but their height relative to one another only changed a little bit because we added more resolution, but for all intents and purposes, it looks more or less the same. Okay, so now we're back to our simplified 2-bit image that's a 4x5 pixel grid. Let's go back to an 8-bit image, and what I mean by that is instead of having 4 potential values for each pixel, we're gonna go back to our full 256 color scale. So all of a sudden now, instead of having 4 spikes of different heights, you've got a bunch of different spikes all of the same height. And since we now know how histograms work, we can pretty easily explain this. Instead of having 4 categories, now we're gonna have 256 different categories, or 0 to 255, which makes 256 possible shades of gray. Y-axes, instead of having 1 through 6, now we only have 0 or 1. So that means there's only one of every different shade of gray you see in this grid. Before there was different height lines, but now there's all one height line, only because every single box in this image is a different shade of gray. Every spike you see is the same height, i.e. 1 pixel. Okay, so let's start slowly adding back resolution to our image, and you'll actually see the histogram start to take shape into what you're normally seeing. Okay, we're back to our full resolution image, and now all of a sudden you can see there's millions of pixels now that we're charting on our histogram, so the histogram takes more of a fluid shape. And you can see there's different bumps. There's a big bump on the right side of the histogram, which corresponds to all those bright pixels that you see in the background of the sky, of the concrete in the background, the snow. And then there's a bunch of dark pixels. There's a spike of dark on the far left, which is your shadows, and those probably correspond to our hats, our pants, maybe the corners of the image which are darker because of the vignette. And then in the middle, there's a few humps that correspond to the various midtones in the image. So you can kind of see that just looking at the histogram gives you an idea of what tones are in your image. And that can be very useful for a lot of different reasons. The first thing that I use a histogram for is gauging exposure. So if you're taking photos, if your histogram is shifted to the far to the left and your image looks too dark and underexposed, your histogram will tell you that because all you'll see are spikes on the left side of the histogram.
So what that means is that there will be more, number of black pixels on the left hand side, right? Because we know the y-axis counts the number of pixels, right? So if all of them are going to the black and you're what we call clipping, so exceeding the entire graph, that means you have way more black pixels in your image than the histogram can count.
Firstly, if your image is overexposed or there's too many bright image values, you'll see your histogram is.
As you can see, now everything is compressed to the right hand side because X, right, as we talked about, is the different shades of gray. So now we're shifting every single pixel in here to the white spectrum. And now every single pixel here is slightly brighter than they were before.
Shifted to the right. If you have a perfectly exposed image, generally speaking, the histogram is going to be evenly distributed. Now there's always exceptions to this rule, but that's just a general rule of thumb. Okay, so we've only been talking about a black and white image here, which is a single data set, a single black and white channel. What about when you're dealing with a color image? So that's actually comprised of 3 different data sets, or 3 different channels as we say, a red, a green, and a blue channel, which are your primary colors when you're talking about additive color theory. I'm just going to show you here one data set, or the red channel here. So if we turn off the green and blue, our image turns completely red, which is what we'd expect. And you can see that the histogram for the red channel now is the only one with data shown. If we turn the red channel off and turn on the green channel, you can see now the green channel is the only thing that shows data. And finally, the blue channel, again, you guessed it, the blue histogram now only has information. So if we turn all of these back on, you can see all 3 channels have information. They're all overlaid, and now all of a sudden our image looks like it's in full living color. So what if you get rid of the red channel? Well, you're left with just the green and blue, and boom, you've got a cyan looking image. What if you take out the green channel and just go red and blue? Well, now you've got a magenta purpley looking image. Or what if you just put red and green together? You guessed it, you've got a yellow looking image. It's all three of these channels combined that give you a full color image. Now it's mostly the combined RGB channel or the luminance channel that you're looking at when you're gauging exposure, but each individual color channel can be useful if you're trying to see if one particularly is clipped. If you've got a really red looking scene, your red channel might actually be clipped, but the blue and the green channels might not be. So the overall...
So as you can see right here, an overexposed area that falls outside the maximum intensity that can be represented. So as I said before, if you're clipping on your bright pixels, there's going to be way more pixels that are bright on the right hand side that, you know, the histogram cannot count it. It's exceeding the entire thing. So meaning you're going to lose information there. There's nothing there that you can achieve, you can like bring down back. And this is why that you need to shoot a well-balanced image when you're taking a photograph, because when you get back to home, when you're going on computer, if you're trying to edit a picture, if it's completely white pixels, there's no information there. You can't achieve it, you can't change it back, it's just gonna be white, right? So this is why you need to shift it in the middle. And then we're gonna look over like some exceptions in which that you really cannot expose it correctly for the middle, but I have to.
Histogram doesn't look like it's overexposed, but you can tell that your skin tones or your red is actually clipped. But it's more so advantageous to understand the different histograms for each channel when you're using things like curves. And we're going to do a tutorial on that later. In fact, I was going to do a curves tutorial, but then I realized I really have to explain how histograms work to really get the most out of that. So expect that video next. So there you have it. That's how a histogram works. You now understand it, and hopefully you can use it in your workflow, whether it's gauging exposure when you take the image or gauging edits when you're doing post-processing. If you have any questions, ask below.
Okay. Alright, going back to this one. Can you guys see the slideshow? Alright. So basically what I said here is that mostly you want the lines to concentrate in the middle so that no information is clipped, right? But sometimes when you're maybe shooting out in broad daylight, for example, and you have a model in front of you and the bright sunlight above you, okay, in this situation you can't really expose it well, because if you expose for your model, your background is going to be clipped. If you expose for your background, your model is going to be clipped. So you're going to either achieve overexposure or underexposure of an image. Preferably, under this situation, we want to underexpose it more than we want to overexpose it, because generally you can bring out the information from the blacks much better than you can for the whites. So if you have an overexposed image, you're going to have a harder time trying to get anything out of those white pixels. But if you have black pixels, you generally can shift it more toward the white side, and that's basically like the rule. So that will be it for today. We talked about how you can balance an image by using a histogram, always shooting raw and what it is, and we use priority mode, and sometimes it will give you a better result than for manual and definitely auto. And the fact that you need to include foregrounds in your image most of the times to add a sense of depth. And thank you. That will be it for this entire course.